who have been living in fear of criminals. This bill restores necessary and effective penalties for extortion, particularly addressing the use of firearms, the involvement of organized crime, and the destructive act of arson. We can no longer stand by as our communities suffer. I urge all members of the House to support Bill C-381. It's time to send a clear message that we are committed to the safety and security of our citizens. By passing this bill, we will demonstrate that we stand for justice, security, and we stand for peace of mind that every Canadian deserves. Let's take decisive action today. Let's pass this bill, ensure that our streets are safe again. It's not just our duty, it's our responsibility to bring home safe streets for every Canadian, restoring trust in the justice system that protects, deters, and delivers real justice. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to speak on this crucial issue. Let's work together to make Canada a place where safety and security are not just ideas, but reality.
Continuing debate with the Honourable Member for Humber River, Black Creek.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy to be able to add a few comments on to this discussion tonight, which is a very important discussion. When we talk about community safety, safety for all Canadians, it's critically important that we all participate and that we ensure that we have given it our full attention. So on Bill C-381, I'm going to read out what it is so that anybody that's watching will get a better feeling and understanding. Bill C-381 would amend the offence of extortion to create a mandatory minimum penalty of 4 years where a firearm other than a restricted or prohibited firearm is used in the commission of the offence, and a minimum sentencing of 3 years in any other case of extortion. There is already a maximum minimum of when a restricted or prohibited firearm is used and the offence is committed in association with organized crime. This bill, from my honourable colleague from Edmonton Mill Woods, the bill would repeal the requirement that extortion committed for the benefit of, at the direction of, or in association with a criminal organization be committed with a firearm, meaning that MMPs of 5 and 7 years would apply to any case involving organized crime. This bill would add an aggravating factor at sentencing where the person convicted of extortion also committed arson. It's an important bill, and one that I'm very confident that my colleague from Edmonton Mill Woods thought about very carefully before presenting it as his private member's bill. That clearly his community in particular is the subject of a lot of extortion according to what we read in the newspapers and so on. And I think that the bill reflects his frustration and concern with our justice system overall, as many of us do. It doesn't always play out the way we would like it to in a variety of different cases. But trying to make the extortion, I don't think it deters anyone. But I know that it certainly makes the private member who put this forward as his private member's bill very interested in trying to find a solution to an ongoing problem. Extortion is illegal in Canada today. Perpetrators need to be apprehended and punished without question. There is mandatory minimum penalty of 7 years for a repeat extortion with a firearm. These penalties show just how seriously the criminal code takes this behavior as extortion, and we don't want to see extortion happening in Canada, and we do not intend to tolerate it. Serious crimes will always deserve very serious punishments. That said, it's been proven time and time again that overly harsh mandatory minimum penalties on first-time offenders don't deter crimes. I wish it did, but clearly the evidence is that it doesn't. I've been here quite a few years and was here when the previous Conservative government introduced mandatory minimums. And I remember when we had that discussion and debate at committee and in the House, and I was always a bit in another platform because I thought if that's going to work, then way to go, then that's what we need to have. But over the years, we've seen, fortunately, that it doesn't work. It doesn't work the way the Conservative Party, when they introduced it, thought it would, and it's played out very differently. The previous legal advisor to Prime Minister Harper has recently admitted himself that the harsh approach to criminal justice is ineffective. To quote him, he has said the maximum minimums are a grave policy failure and cheap politics. And again, I go back to the fact when it was introduced, I was very supportive. I thought it was going to be an answer to try to deter some of the crime, but it didn't work that way. We ended up having people without the flexibility to be able to look for alternative sentencing opportunities to truly prevent recidivism from happening. We've seen it, that it's ineffective at reducing crime. It actually increases recidivism. We've often been told that once someone goes to jail, no matter what the amount of time that they spend there, the repeat offenders are what follows so many times. So it doesn't necessarily help. I think people know my history. I have pretty strong feelings when it comes to guns and this whole issue. I had a first cousin who was a police officer shot to death. And I signed petitions for the death penalty in those days. But that was then, and I've learned a lot since then. And the fact that I got, I don't know how many thousands of signatures to call in for the death penalty, a lot of that was because I was hurting and in pain as a result of having that terrible thing happen to my cousin and killing a young 32-year-old police officer with 3 young children. So I have always taken a very strong stance when it comes to the justice issue, and I want to see our justice system stronger and better and more effective. Is this particular bill that's been put forward going to help with that? I don't think so. But that's what committees are for, is to have further discussions and talk about the pros and cons of all of it. And I think anytime we are looking at ways that we can reduce recidivism, reduce crime in our country is a good thing to do. But back to Mr. Perrin, the previous legal advisor to Prime Minister Harper. One of his quotes was, "If history is any judge, the current Conservative leader should know that MMPs may not be worth the paper they're printed on. What's worse, even if they do pass constitutional muster, they will only exacerbate the essential challenges facing the criminal justice system." As my previous colleague mentioned in the block, there needs to be meaningful innovation, ideas of different ways of handling things. So far, we have not been awfully successful, I think, in finding ways to deter serious crime. We know we've got organized crime happening in Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal when it comes to the stealing of vehicles, shipping them out through Montreal primarily. I think they arrested 19 people involved in that particular part of it. So thank God we have police officers who spend the hours that they do out there on the streets trying to ensure that our cities can stay safe. And we're all looking for answers, right? But we do need to be able to provide judges with flexibility to make a decision on what they want to do. There are serious offenders out there that need to be dealt appropriately. And plea bargains, I don't think, are a way to go on most all of these cases. Any of these things, especially if you're talking about extortion, you want to make sure that they are dealt with as sincerely as right now the criminal code calls for very serious penalties on that aspect of it. So we want to do whatever we can. If the bill goes to committee, it'll give an opportunity to talk more about how MMPs don't appear to work. But are there other opportunities? What else can be done? And maybe this is a way that we can really send a very strong message that Canada is not going to tolerate extortion happening to any community. It usually happens, in this case, it's referred to, it was a South Asian community that's being subject to extortion. And I think we have an obligation to stand up and push against that and to protect those communities that are being intimidated and belittled and threatened. They come to Canada to start a new life. and to be able to have a successful business, and they should not have to worry about being extorted. This has happened in other communities, not just the South Asian. There are a variety of communities that are extorted, and I've heard it within the Italian community some time ago. So we need to have strong penalties. Extortion needs to have, and it has, a very strong policy right now in the criminal code, and we want to see that it continues. And if this will be discussed at the committee, if it gets to committee level, and further discussions would be very interesting to see if there are any new ideas and ways that we can make our criminal code even stronger than what it currently is today. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Mr. Speaker.
Continuing debate with the Honourable Member for St. Catharines.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity to rise and appreciate the member who brought this forward. I know that there is concern in his community with respect to rise in certain types of crime, but I would point to the fact that if we look to the United States and the extensive use of mandatory minimum penalties, I was wondering if the Conservative members could show me which state in the United States actually is succeeding with these types of criminal justice policies. It's not something that works. It's something that committees have studied time and time again, and shown that it's not working. Even though it's well-intentioned, policy-wise, it won't work. And I see my time is up.
I mean, the Honourable Member will have plenty more when the opportunity comes back up, but the time provided for consideration of private member's business has now expired, and the order is dropped to the bottom of the order of precedence on the order paper.
Pursuant to the standing order, a motion to adjourn the House is deemed to have been moved and seconded. So the motion is that this House do now adjourn.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the House of Commons passed Bill C-234. Normally that's not a remarkable statement, but it bears repeating for comprehension. The House of Commons, made up of 338 elected members of Parliament to democratically legislate the laws of Canada, passed Bill C-234. This bill was a private member's bill to remove the carbon tax from farmers so that the thousands of dollars in unrebated carbon taxes that every farmer pays will no longer have to be built into the price of food. During a crisis of food affordability and food inflation, this is a common sense way to do something immediate and concrete to help farmers produce affordable food for Canadians. The elected members of Parliament passed this bill over the objection of the governing Liberals. It was sent to the Senate, where the same legislative process takes place, but during this process, and at the clear and obvious behest of the Prime Minister and his government, the Senate gutted the bill by removing heating fuels for barns from the bill. They wanted to kill the bill altogether, but this government's extraordinary lobbying efforts succeeded in gutting the bill by ensuring that the carbon tax still applies to heating buildings like barns. And this adds enormous cost to the production of food, particularly the cost of eggs, chickens, pork, and dairy. Adding the tax on food production, axing the tax on food production would be a simple way to address inflation on food, which continues to rise even faster than the general rate of inflation, and along with the staggering cost of rent and mortgage payments, puts the greatest pressure on the most vulnerable Canadians, people whose entire family budgets can't cover the cost of food and shelter. So I asked the government that following a desperate weekend of panic-stricken phone calls, which resulted in the Senate gutting the bill, will the Prime Minister listen to Canadians and take the carbon tax off farmers, First Nations, and families who want to heat their homes? And I mentioned First Nations in my question because First Nations are challenging the federal government's authority to impose the carbon tax on them. And I mentioned farmers who are price takers, who only have so much room to pass on higher costs without simply having to shut down production. And consumers have to pay more for food. So the response was an insipid mix of unrelated nonsense talking points. And since that time, their House leader has falsely tried to blame the pathetically really, tried to blame the Conservatives for the failure of 234 from passing this House again, ignoring the entire reason or pretending not to know why this bill is back here in the first place. It's here because their senators are doing the bidding of the Prime Minister that appointed them and gutting the bill. The Conservative Deputy Whip offered to pass the bill by unanimous consent in its original form, but it was the Liberals that refused to do that. So I asked them again, will they respect the will of this elected House? Will they recognize the role that the Prime Minister played and his ministers in begging and bullying senators into rejecting a bill passed by the elected members of this chamber? Will they realize that an overwhelming number of Canadians, including most provincial and territorial premiers, that the carbon tax is punishing people who just want to eat, heat, and transport themselves? Do they not see that when you make a basic input like energy more expensive, you reduce output, which leads to higher prices? And if they won't axe the carbon tax altogether, will they at least agree to axe it on farmers so they can bring down the price of groceries?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Et du développement social.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful for the opportunity to explain to the Honourable Member of Calgary-Rocky Ridge that putting a price on pollution is at the centre of our government's plan to fight climate change and curb the devastating effects on our communities and economy. Monsieur le Président, les conséquences...
Mr. Speaker, the negative consequences of climate change are very real. Canadians have not forgotten the devastating forest fires last year that burned large tracts of land in Canada and left smoke in the air. We can't sit by idly instead of coming up with solutions to deal with climate change. Doing nothing is unacceptable. We need to take action. We need to take action on behalf of Canadians today and future generations, our children and our grandkids.
Steps that will have effective, concrete impacts. And a vital part of this plan is Canada's price on pollution. Pollution has a cost. It has a cost to Canadians, to communities, to our health, and to our economy. Applying a price on carbon pollution is widely recognized as one of the most efficient ways to reduce emissions and to fight the devastating effects of climate change. De plus, notre mécanisme...
In addition, our approach to putting a price on pollution is an affordable one. We often hear people here say that the price on pollution is costing Canadians too dearly, but Mr. Speaker, I can assure you that that is quite false. In provinces where the federal price on pollution applies, the lion's share of the revenues are returned to Canadians and lower income people benefit the most.
With the cost of living for a majority of Canadian families, while encouraging choices that will help Canada lower its emissions. Our price on pollution ensures 8 out of 10 households in these provinces are receiving more money back through quarterly Canada carbon rebate payments than they pay. Thanks to our government's pollution price mechanism, a family of 4 living in one of these provinces can receive up to $1,800. As you can see with our plan, we are not only fighting climate change, we are also returning money to Canadians.
Mr. Speaker, the government doesn't keep any of the proceeds of the federal price on pollution. The government gives the money back to households and small businesses, to farmers and Indigenous governments. International experts agree that our price on pollution is an effective way of fighting climate change.
With this approach, we are sending a clear message that pollution has a price. Putting a price on carbon pollution encourages reduction across the economy while giving households and businesses the flexibility to decide when and how to make changes. To achieve this, we need to maintain the price signal that over the long term is necessary for carbon pricing to work and bring emissions down. Removing pollution pricing, as the opposition has called for, will eliminate its powerful incentive to encourage people and businesses to pollute less, to change their behaviors. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Calgary-Rocky Ridge.
Well, Madam Speaker, so the response is that the government will continue to tax farmers, to apply an input tax on farmers to increase their costs, which inflates and increases the cost of food. They will give then some rebates to some households, which the Parliamentary Budget Officer has clearly stated does not cover the cost to those households of the carbon tax, particularly when you include all of the higher costs that they incur. Not just the carbon tax they see on their heating bill, not just the carbon tax that they see at the pump, but the general inflation of all of the goods that it's applied to. So the farmer doesn't get the rebate to cover these costs. The farmer is either going to cut production, which will raise the price of food, or they have to pass it on and make the food more expensive. Just axe the tax. If you can't do it for everything, at least do it for farmers.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government knows that ensuring sustainability for future generations is paramount, and that's why we're taking action. We're protecting people from the dangers and costs of climate change and ensuring Canada continues to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions.
Not only does our price on pollution help combat climate change, but it is also given more money back directly to many Canadian families at a time when so many need it most. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberal Party platform in 2021 promised the re-elected Liberal government would implement the Canada Disability Benefit and that, quote, this new benefit will reduce poverty amongst persons with disabilities in the same manner as the Guaranteed Income Supplement and the Canada Child Benefit. They, of course, were elected that year. In the time since, thanks to consistent pressure from the disability community to keep that promise, this government slowly put forward a bill that needed significant improvements every step of the way, including ones that my team and I secured, like requiring an application process that is without barriers and indexing the benefit to inflation. This government then told the disability community they were consulting with them, including inviting people from across the country to spend significant time completing a lengthy survey. Finally, yesterday, we get this government's proposal for the Canada Disability Benefit in Budget 2024, and it was nothing that folks with disabilities were calling for. The maximum amount, $200 a month, is far too little to actually reduce poverty levels amongst folks with disabilities. They've limited eligibility to those already receiving the incredibly burdensome application process for the disability tax credit, in contravention of the amendment I mentioned earlier calling for it to be barrier-free, and it won't even start till July 2025. The total cost is just over $1 billion a year. Now, the two programs the Liberals promised the Canada Disability Benefit would reduce poverty in the same way they did, well, the Guaranteed Income Supplement is about 15 times as much and pays out a maximum of just over $1,000 a month, and the Canada Child Benefit is 24 times as much annually and pays out a maximum of just over $600. The Canada Disability Benefit, as proposed, does little to actually help the disability community and seems to be much more about convincing non-disabled Canadians this government is helping people with disabilities than actually doing what they said they intended on doing. As a result, folks with disabilities are deeply disappointed, and that's putting it kindly. Here's a sampling of reactions from the past 24 hours I'd like to read into the record. Some of the language is quite raw, but it reflects the pain that some folks are feeling. Laura says, quote, I've never been so disappointed in something in my entire life. Mitchell, quote, this is the ultimate failure. What an atrocity. No fairness here. Cody, quote, $2,400 a year? That's not just a joke, but an outright slap in the face to the disability community. You should be ashamed of yourself. Kate, quote, this budget announcement of adding a max of $200 more a month to a select few disabled people is the most Liberal Party thing I've ever seen. Elandria, quote, so much for lifting disabled people out of poverty in Canada, they really put the nothing in nothing without us. And leading organizations who've been advocating for the benefit, Krista Carr from Inclusion Canada, quote, our disappointment cannot be overstated. This benefit was supposed to lift people with disabilities out of poverty, not merely make them marginally less poor than they already are. Samuel Ragot from La Société Québécoise de la Déficience Intellectuelle, quote, this is worse than my worst case scenario. Not only is it not enough, but using the DTC will gatekeep the benefit from so many people. My heart goes to the people living in poverty who have to keep fighting every day to survive. And last, Michelle Hewitt from Disability Without Poverty, quote, "To say we are disappointed is an understatement. Yesterday's announcement on the CDB was woefully inadequate." Again, it looks to me like this government isn't even trying to do right by people with disabilities. My question, will the Parliamentary Secretary admit that the Canada Disability Benefit as proposed yesterday is a performative measure intended to make non-disabled Canadians think this government is doing something of substance for the disability community when they're clearly not?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Revenue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and through you, I'll thank the member for his brilliant advocacy and for his question on behalf of persons with disabilities. He knows, as does everyone in this place, that protecting and helping the most vulnerable in our society is a fundamental Canadian principle, and it is a fundamental principle of our government. When it comes to people with disabilities, we have invested more money in the last 8 years than ever before. And I take the point. Is it enough? Absolutely not. Do we need to do more? Absolutely we do. But we have made progress. In comparison, the previous Conservative governments promised and failed to deliver a National Disability Act. Our Liberal government made the Accessibility Canada Act a reality. But there is still a lot more to do. That said, Mr. Speaker, we are moving as quickly as possible on the Canada Disability Benefit. And of course, we understand that the disability community is anxious to see extra dollars in their bank accounts, but we must get it right to make the delivery of the benefit as smooth, as targeted, and as effective as possible. Budget 2024 proposes funding of $6.1 billion over 6 years, beginning in this fiscal year, 2024-25, and $1.4 billion per year ongoing, for the first ever federal Canada Disability Benefit. This represents an important next step in the journey for this. I can't talk about the journey of the Canada Disability Benefit without talking about the years of relentless advocacy from the community. And I want to thank all of those who have been relentless in their advocacy as they championed the need and priorities of persons with disabilities. I encourage you to continue to engage with our government as we move forward in the next chapter. The lived experiences of persons with disabilities has been a key part of the consultation process. In the true spirit of nothing without us, we engaged with persons with disabilities, stakeholders, and all Canadians on key issues. In the coming months, once we have published the draft regulations in Part 1 of the Canada Gazette, Canadians will again be invited to provide feedback. As the Honourable Member knows, the Act requires that regulations be in place by June 2025, with money flowing into bank accounts by July 2025. Let me assure all members in this House and all Canadians that we are on track to meet this timeline. This is the first federal government step up and support of persons with disabilities by creating a new and specific benefit just for them. The Budget 2024 announcement unlocks the ability to proceed with the extensive and intense behind-the-scenes work needed to deliver the CDB. We need the time to not just be focused on the developing regulations, but to build the internal infrastructure and support systems that are necessary to actually deliver the program and to allow the PTs, the provinces and territories, to adjust their policies to ensure that there are no unintended clawbacks. This is a crucial time as we carefully balance the need to strengthen our social security net while making sure government spending is able to help with everyday cost of living. We are committed to creating a better, fairer country for generations to come. But as I said, Mr. Speaker, there is more work to do. It is the next stop in the journey of building a barrier-free Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for Kitchener Centre for his question and for his ongoing excellent advocacy on this. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, we've had this conversation dozens of times in this House over the last 3 years. I've heard time and again about a need for time for the regulations, negotiations with provinces and territories, nothing without us, we need to do more. The difference now is that with this budget, their cards are on the table. There was a dollar amount in that budget, and that dollar amount was $200 a month. This government set the expectation that this benefit was meant to lift people out of poverty. And they find money for the Trans Mountain Pipeline. They find $35 billion for that. They send $18 billion to oil and gas companies that are already making tens of billions in record-breaking profits. But when it came time to step up and demonstrate that there was well-placed trust from the disability community, they were let down. And so my question to the Parliamentary Secretary is she and others going to put pressure on this government to expand what was in the budget and do better?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I really appreciate the advocacy of the member. As I've said, I myself have a nephew who has severe disabilities. And right now, in his first 5 years of life is when he needs the most support to be able to grow and to live a functioning life. I completely understand the need to ensure that the disability community has that support that they need so that they can continue to flourish and to thrive in a community that is barrier-free. And Mr. Speaker, during these past 8 years, we have invested unprecedented amounts of money to further the inclusion and the financial stability of persons with disabilities. This Canada Disability Benefit represents the largest single item in Budget 2024 of over $6 billion. This is not insignificant, Mr. Speaker, and this is the first time in Canada that there will be a federal benefit designed to specifically meet the needs of people with disabilities. And like all progressive programs that we've delivered, they are built to be enhanced and to be expanded. And I look forward to working with the member to ensure that, and with the disability community, to ensure that we are continuing to advocate for a barrier-free community for them.
The Honourable Member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Now, before I really dive into the substance of my question here today, I just want to give a quick shout out to the U13 boys hockey league champions from the South Saskatchewan Hockey League. I was fortunate enough to coach my son's hockey team this year, and the story starts, I was in a classroom in Mossbank back in September. I was talking with a classroom there, and it turned out half those kids were on the hockey team that won our league. So congratulations to Wood River Flyers on winning the South Saskatchewan Hockey League. Big shout out to Devin Smith, Jesse Packett, Kipton Tremblay, Grayson Eisen, Ashton Claremont, Lawson Lehman, Ryder Talon, Alex Jolly, Griffin DeWolf, John Jennett, Cole Massey, Austin Pritchard, Carson Crooks, Kyle Batty, Turner Talon, Grady Crooks, and of course their head coach, Dustin DeWolf. Big congratulations to you guys on a great year and a job well done. So back in December, I had the opportunity to ask the government about the carbon tax. You know, this is a topic that is, it's not going away anytime soon. When I talk to people back home, in particular this time of year, it's April, the farmers, they're itching to get going in the fields here. They see the costs and the effects of the carbon tax right up front, because farmers back home, they're price takers. They don't get to pass costs on to anybody. At least not back home. There are other farmers in greenhouses that grow produce that they're able to pass on some of those prices, which is, that's a whole nother issue. I'm going to focus more so on the grain farmers that I have back home today. So for them, they have to pay the carbon tax on their trucking. They have to pay it. They're still waiting for the grain drying bill to pass. So there's a lot of things that they still have to pay it on. If they want to get fertilizer shipped out to their farm, they got to pay the carbon tax on that. So they have to absorb that price. They cannot pass that cost on to anybody else. So they are paying the cost for it. They also don't get to sell their crop to anybody, right? So there's a global price that is set on their crops. So they have to buy their machinery, they have to buy their crops, they have to buy their inputs, and then they grow the crops and they harvest the crops, right? So they're price takers. There are some exemptions for on-farm usage, but that does not cover the cost that is associated with many other activities. And that's part of what we're trying to get the attention on the government for. But there's another element to the carbon tax, Mr. Speaker, that the government continues to not address. And that is the issue of municipalities and of towns. I gave the example previously about the town of Shaunavon, for instance. It's going to be an 8 or 9% property tax increase for them to cover the cost of the carbon tax alone. The city of Swift Current, it's a multiple percentage point increase on property taxes, again, to cover off the carbon tax. The town of Kindersley, they've got a fairly new hockey rink that was built in the last 10 years. They just recently built a brand new aquatic center. For them to run just those two facilities, they're paying $12,000 a month in carbon tax. So the costs are exorbitant, but that cost goes directly back onto the ratepayers. So the same ratepayers are paying the carbon tax on their gas, their groceries, their home heating. They also have to pay it on the increases on their property tax, as they have to pay the cost that the town of Kindersley has to pay on these buildings, and there's no rebate that covers that. So this is just yet another layer to the carbon tax that people are getting gouged on, and the government continues to refuse to do anything about that.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canadians have been through a lot in the past 5 years, and many are struggling with the cost of living. We have heard numerous calls to scale back the carbon pricing system in response. But carbon pricing is not the problem. It's designed to help families through the Canada Carbon Rebate, which will help lower and middle income households most of all. That's why a pause on carbon pricing simply won't help families keep life affordable. Le gouverneur de la Banque du Canada.
The governor of the Bank of Canada has explained that carbon pricing creates only 0.15% of yearly inflation, which is a tiny fraction of the high inflation we've seen. And economists believe that carbon pricing is responsible for an increase of 0.33% in the cost of groceries. Once again, this is an infinitesimal fraction of what we've all faced over the last few months. This can be explained by the fact that farmers are already exempted from carbon pricing in most of their activities. Bill C-234 will simply not make a difference for households facing an increase in the cost of food. It would be specious to suggest that it will help. It is logical that carbon pricing does not cause inflation, a phenomenon taking place throughout the world, including in many countries that do not have a carbon pricing system.
Are events like the disruptions caused by the COVID-19 crisis and Russia's war in the Ukraine driving energy prices up. Canada's